Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be jumping into a period of history that honestly feels like it was ripped from the pages of a thriller novel.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be talking about the U.S.,
Yeah.
Russia,
Yeah.
Ukraine, and the Middle East,
Wow.
all kind of swirling together in this,
Yeah.
chaotic time period
Yeah.
with the war in Ukraine
Of course.
and the recent Hamas attacks on Israel.
Right.
And our guide through this maze is going to be Bob Woodward's book, War.
Oh, yeah. He really gets you into the minds of these world leaders. He doesn't just report on events. He was right there in the room,
Yeah.
capturing those behind-the-scenes moments that usually stay hidden,
Yeah.
talking about their anxieties, those private conversations, even some pretty intense outbursts.
Right. So anxieties, outbursts, private conversations.
This is good stuff. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We know that things are tense between the U.S. and Russia. But the war in Ukraine, this didn't just come out of nowhere, right?
Exactly. To understand why Putin did what he did, you really have to go back and look at his desire to restore Russia to what he sees as its former glory, that imperial power it once held. And for Putin, Ukraine isn't just some neighboring country.
Right.
He sees it as a core part of Russia culturally and historically.
And Woodward shares this anecdote about Putin bringing his large black dog
Oh, yeah.
to a meeting with Angela Merkel, knowing she's afraid of dogs.
Classic Putin.
Right.
Such a calculated move, and it speaks to what intelligence reports were already saying about him at the time, that he was becoming more isolated, more willing to take risks, even as he grew increasingly paranoid.
Yeah.
So U.S. officials were in a real bind trying to figure out how to deter Putin without pushing him over the edge.
So it was like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
What did those diplomatic efforts look like?
Well, you had those intense meetings, like the one between Secretary Blinken and Lavrov, where they were clashing over the Minsk agreements,
Right.
which were supposed to bring peace to the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. But you have to remember, the Donbas region was already caught in this conflict with separatists backed by Russia.
Right. And were those Minsk agreements, were they successful at all?
Not really. They were meant to stabilize the situation, but Putin saw them more as a way to keep Ukraine off balance and under his influence,
Yeah.
and the U.S. knew it.
They knew it.
Yeah.
Wow. Then February 2022 happens. Putin launches this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the world is stunned.
Yeah.
Woodward really captures that sense of urgency as Biden and his team try to figure out what to do.
Biden's focus was threefold: uniting allies,
Okay.
getting military aid to Ukraine,
Right.
and hitting Russia hard with sanctions.
Hmm.
For Biden, this wasn't just some far-off conflict. He
Yeah.
saw Ukraine as being central to his entire presidency and was determined to stop Putin from getting away with what he did in Crimea back in 2014.
Woodward even quotes Biden as saying, okay, I'm revoking his goddamn license,
Wow.
which you don't hear every day from a president.
You don't.
But sending American troops to Ukraine?
Yeah.
Was that ever really on the table?
Biden ultimately decided against it. He knew that putting American boots on the ground in Ukraine would mean a direct confrontation with Russia, and that could escalate things to a whole other level, maybe even a global conflict.
Right. And as if the invasion wasn't bad enough, everyone starts worrying about Putin's next move. Could he actually resort to using nuclear weapons?
The intelligence assessments at the time were deeply unsettling. They were basically saying it was coin flip,
Wow.
50-50 chance that Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay, now for those who don't know, what are tactical nuclear weapons?
These are smaller scale nukes meant for use on a battlefield.
Okay.
And just imagine what that would mean.
Hmm.
Even a small nuclear attack. It would completely upend the global order.
So how did Biden respond to that threat?
He went straight to the top. He actually appealed directly to Xi Jinping, urging him to use China's influence to try and get Putin to back down.
Wow.
And that shows you how Biden was thinking about this. It wasn't just a U.S.-Russia issue. It was a global threat.
Right, a global threat. Okay, so you've got this major international crisis unfolding, and then back at home, the 2024 election is heating up, and Donald Trump is back in the picture.
Oh, boy. It's like one fire after another.
Yeah.
And the book dives into what was driving Trump's continued popularity, even with the January 6th investigations and all the other controversies surrounding him.
And it's not just about popularity, right?
Yeah.
Woodward talks about concerns from military leaders about what Trump might actually do if he were reelected.
Yeah. There's this anecdote where Trump asks about the Black Lives Matter protests. Why can't you just shoot them?
Wow.
And it really shook people up. This glimpse into how willing he was to use force even against American citizens. Military leaders like General Milley were seriously worried about a repeat of January 6th, but even bigger, with mass deportations and the military being used to put down unrest in the streets.
So very scary stuff. And then there's this contrast with Biden. He's older, he's had some gaffes, but he was seen as a steady hand, which is probably what a lot of people wanted after the turbulence of the Trump years. But Woodward doesn't shy away from those questions about Biden's age and health either.
It's tricky, right? People want transparency. They want to know their president is up to the job. But at the same time, you don't want to undermine public confidence, especially when the world feels like it's hanging by a thread.
Right. And just when things couldn't seem to get any more complicated, you have the Middle East exploding. The Hamas attacks on Israel were absolutely shocking, and the details that come out in Woodward's book are horrific.
It was a level of violence and brutality that most people couldn't even imagine. He talks about the utter chaos, the terror that Israeli civilians experienced. There's one account that's particularly disturbing, about a young woman found dead in her underwear, paraded through Gaza by Hamas militants.
It's just awful. And Biden, with his personal connection to Israel, must have felt incredible pressure. He was committed to their security, but he also knew that a full-blown war in the Middle East would be catastrophic for everyone.
You know, he was in a terrible position, and Woodward says Biden's frustration boiled over privately. He even called Putin and Netanyahu two of the biggest fucking assholes in the world,
Wow.
which I think shows just how much strain he was under.
Right, so he's got the war in Ukraine, a hostage crisis in Israel, and the threat of Trump looming in the background.
Right,
It's like a three-ring circus of global chaos.
And that's just scratching the surface. We haven't even touched on those intelligence failures that allowed the Hamas attacks to happen, or the incredibly delicate hostage negotiations that were going on behind closed doors.
Right.
There are so many layers to this, and Woodward's book really helps you understand just how complex and dangerous this whole period was.
Right, it's like a thriller.
It is.
It really is.
Yeah.
Absolutely wild. So we'll be back in part 2 to dig deeper into...
Yeah, can't wait. And those hostage negotiations, they were incredibly tense. You've got to remember, Hamas had taken over 1,200 Israelis hostage,
Right.
including families, women, children. It was a horrific situation.
So what were they trying to achieve with these hostages? What was the goal?
Well, obviously Hamas wanted to use them as leverage to try and force Israel into making concessions.
Right.
And Israel, they were desperate to get their people back, but they also didn't want to be seen as giving in to terrorists.
Right, so it's this impossible situation.
Yeah.
Woodward talks about Qatar's role in all this.
Okay.
Why was Qatar involved?
So Qatar had actually become something of a go-between in the region. They'd built up these lines of communication with Hamas.
Right.
So Biden leaned on them pretty heavily to try and secure the release of the hostages, especially the Americans.
So even a smaller country like Qatar can have a big impact on something like this.
Absolutely. They've become a key player in Middle Eastern diplomacy. But even with their help, things weren't easy. Woodward describes a moment when Biden received intelligence suggesting that some of the female hostages might have been raped.
Oh my gosh. That's just horrifying. It's hard to even think about.
It's a stark reminder that these conflicts, they're not just about politics and territory. They have a real human cost, a devastating impact on people's lives.
Right.
And while these negotiations were going on, Biden was also trying to prevent the whole thing from escalating into a full-blown war. He knew Israel wanted to retaliate, and he was trying to hold them back.
Right. But wouldn't Israel have the right to defend itself after an attack like that?
Of course. But Biden understood that a massive ground invasion of Gaza, which is what Netanyahu was pushing for, would likely lead to a bloodbath.
Right.
You're talking about thousands of potential civilian casualties, a humanitarian disaster on a massive scale.
So what was Biden's approach then, if he's trying to hold them back?
He pushed back against Netanyahu's plan. He argued that a full-scale invasion would be a strategic blunder. It would isolate Israel, alienate allies, and could potentially destabilize the whole region.
So he's thinking several steps ahead.
Exactly. This is where Biden's experience and his cautious approach come in. He's not just reacting emotionally. He's weighing the potential consequences of every move. But Netanyahu, he was under immense pressure from his own people. He sought a ground invasion as the only way to crush Hamas and guarantee Israel's security.
Right. So you have these two different perspectives clashing.
Absolutely.
Must have been incredibly tense between them.
Oh, absolutely. Woodward describes a phone call where Biden straight up tells Netanyahu, "You're overdoing it,"
Wow.
accusing him of basically pushing Israel towards a catastrophic war.
Wow. He didn't mince words.
It's fascinating, right? You're seeing these two powerful leaders, two men with long histories and strong personalities clashing over this incredibly high-stakes issue. And you have to remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine still raging on.
It's like the world was coming apart at the seams.
It really was. And you've got other threats simmering at the same time. Iran is becoming increasingly aggressive. ISIS-K is on the rise in Afghanistan. It's like every time you put out one fire, another one starts.
Yeah.
And then hanging over everything is the 2024 election and the return of Donald Trump.
And it wasn't just about Trump winning or losing. It was about what he might do if he got back into the White House.
People were really worried. And not just Democrats. Woodward quotes military leaders, intelligence officials, even some Republicans expressing serious concerns about a second Trump term.
Yeah, what were they afraid of? What were they saying?
They were afraid he'd try to dismantle democratic norms,
Yeah.
erode the rule of law, conduct foreign policy based on his whims and grudges, rather than any kind of strategic thinking.
It sounds like people were bracing for the worst.
They were. And Woodward highlights a particular concern: the possibility of Trump pulling the U.S. out of NATO,
No, for those who don't know, what is NATO?
the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is basically a military alliance between the U.S., Canada, and a bunch of European countries.
Okay.
And why was that such a big deal?
Right.
NATO is basically a cornerstone of Western security, a bulwark against Russian aggression.
Yeah.
So if the U.S. were to pull out of NATO, it would be a huge win for Putin and could completely fracture the Western alliance.
Wow. So stakes in the 2024 election, they weren't just about American politics. They had huge global implications.
Absolutely. And while Biden was dealing with all of this, the war in Ukraine, the hostage situation in Gaza, the threat of a second Trump term, he was also facing a more personal challenge: his
Oh, no.
age and his health.
Woodward doesn't shy away from that, does he?
No, he doesn't. He talks about how Biden at 82 years old was facing questions about his stamina, his mental sharpness, his ability to handle the demands of the job.
And were those just attacks from Republicans, or were Democrats worried too?
Even some Democrats were having private conversations about whether Biden had the energy and the mental agility to lead the country through such a tumultuous time. Woodward describes instances where Biden seemed to struggle with his words or appeared confused during public appearances.
That must have been hard for him.
Of course. And Trump and his allies, they jumped all over this, constantly hammering on Biden's age and mental state, painting him as this doddering old man who was out of touch with reality.
Yeah, it was a pretty low blow.
It was, but it was effective. It tapped into those anxieties people already had and raised doubts about Biden's fitness for office, even among some of his supporters.
Right.
So going into the 2024 election, Biden knew he had to address these concerns head on. He had to find a way to convince voters that he was still up to the job.
And that's not just about looking energetic, right? It's about showing you can handle the issues, that you have a vision for the future, that you're the one to lead the country through these incredibly difficult times.
Exactly. And so we're left with this question: could Biden, weighed down by age, facing all these crises and going up against a relentless opponent like Trump, could he actually pull it off? Could he rally the country and the world? Or would he crumble under the pressure?
So the big question is, could Biden actually pull it off? He's got all these things going against him. Age, health concerns, a world on fire. And Trump right there, breathing down his neck.
Well, and that's what makes Woodward's book so compelling. He doesn't give you a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
He doesn't try to make Biden into some kind of superhero or a villain.
Right.
He shapes him as a human being,
Yeah.
trying to make the best decisions he can, often with incomplete information, facing impossible odds.
So he's not perfect. He's got flaws.
Right. He can be stubborn.
Yeah.
He's known for his gaffes.
Yeah.
And his age does show sometimes, but Woodward also shows his empathy. His genuine desire to do what's right, and that incredible depth of experience that very few people on the planet have.
And all that experience, all those years in Washington, it's got to count for something, right?
It's one of his greatest strengths.
Yeah.
Woodward gives you these glimpses of Biden relying on his instincts, his relationships with other world leaders, his understanding of history to try and navigate these incredibly dangerous situations.
You give us an example.
Take Iran.
Okay.
After the Hamas attacks, there was a lot of pressure on Biden to get directly involved. People were saying, we have to do something.
Right. We got to do something.
But he resisted that. He knew that getting dragged into another war in the Middle East would be disastrous, not just for the region, but for his presidency.
So what did he do?
He focused on de-escalation. He worked behind the scenes with allies, with intermediaries, trying to contain the conflict and prevent it from spreading. It wasn't always smooth or pretty.
Right.
But it was the smartest move.
It sounds like he was walking a tightrope again.
Exactly. And it shows that he wasn't just reacting to the pressure, he was thinking long term. He understood the dangers of rushing into things, of using military force as the first option. He'd seen what those kinds of decisions could lead to, how even the best intentions can backfire and create more problems.
This is that balance between action and restraint,
Mm.
knowing when to step in and when to hold back.
And that's something that Biden learned over decades of dealing with international crises. He'd seen those unintended consequences firsthand, the way that even well-meaning interventions can blow up in your face.
And this gets to the heart of what leadership really means, doesn't it?
Huh.
Especially in a world that's changing so fast, where things are so complex.
Right.
You need that experience, that ability to see the bigger picture and anticipate what might happen.
Exactly. And with Biden, you see that experience in action. Again, he's not perfect, but he's a seasoned leader.
Right.
He's made mistakes.
Yeah.
He's learned from them.
Right.
And he's come out of it with a deep understanding of how power works, both at home and on the world stage.
So despite all those challenges, all those
Yeah.
doubts about his age, the constant attacks from Trump, does Biden actually succeed?
Well, according to Woodward, yes. He may not be flashy or charismatic,
Right.
but he's steady, he knows what he's doing, and he's driven by a strong sense of purpose. And at the end of the day, that's what really matters.
It's not about appearances, it's about substance.
Yeah.
It's about making the tough calls,
Mm-hmm.
dealing with those impossible situations, and doing what you think is right for the country, for the world, even when it's not popular or easy.
Woodward's book is a powerful reminder of just how difficult leadership is in this day and age.
Yeah.
It takes experience, wisdom, resilience,
Yeah.
and the courage to make those difficult choices.
Mm.
And while Biden may not be the perfect leader, he embodies those qualities in a way that few others do.
So what's a takeaway for us, for people who are trying to understand this crazy world?
It leaves us with a question, really. As we move into this increasingly uncertain future, with all the global instability, the technological changes, the threat of conflict always looming, what kind of leaders will we need? What qualities will be essential for navigating those challenges?
That's something for all of us to think about. Because the choices we make today, the leaders we choose to follow, they will shape the world we live in tomorrow. This deep dive into war has been a look inside that pressure cooker of leadership.
Yeah.
The weight of those decisions, the impossible situations that leaders at the highest levels face every single day.
It's also a reminder that leadership isn't just something we watch from the sidelines.
Right.
It's a call to action, a challenge to engage with the world around us, to think critically, and to demand from our leaders the wisdom, the courage, and the compassion to guide us through these turbulent times.
Well, there you have it, our deep dive into Bob Woodward's War. It's a complicated story at times, disturbing, but ultimately it's a story about leadership tested by fire. We encourage you to check out the book, grapple with those insights, and form your own opinions. Because ultimately the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create.